that the best literature is not the literature that is grammatically correct or polished or that reads coherently or correctly. The best literature in the world often breaks those rules, right? Like
Mm,
in Absalom, Faulkner has like a 1200 word run-on sentence. A run-on sentence is grammatically incorrect. So much of good writing will use different vernaculars, which may not be regarded as grammatically correct, but that's what makes the work alive and vivid and real. And I think human imperfection is what makes for a good work of art. I mean, the reality is that everyone's using it, right? I mean, I use it to a degree, maybe not in my creative work, and everyone is using it. It's pervasive, it's ubiquitous. So I think in the future, we're going to begin to see a lot of artistic works that are either stamped or prefaced with the fact that this was done by a human. If you're not really reading, you're not going to be able to produce a piece of writing that is rich, layered, complicated, nuanced, and so on and so forth.
Poetry, essays, short stories, novels. There's multiple different, mediums through which we enjoy literature, through which we enjoy books. But with the advent of the internet, social media, and particularly artificial intelligence, has the production of literature, of writing, of art, and the consumption of it changed? This is what we'll be probing in this episode of DigiPod on DawnNews English. And we're happy to be joined by Palvashay Sethi, who is a writer. She does experimental writing, fiction writing, mostly about Pakistan. And she's also a teacher at a university in Karachi. So thank you for joining us, Palvashay.
Thank you so much for having me, Osama.
So to start with, perhaps we can, dive right into it and, explore, the very important question that a lot of people are asking these days, that can artificial intelligence create literature, or does it only imitate art?
So obviously, this is a subject that you're incredibly well versed in, Osama. And but at the outset, I think I want to set a few parameters and create a few distinctions just so that we're on the same page and everyone can understand what we're talking about. So artificial intelligence as a term is pretty capacious and can include multiple tools and a variety of different things. And I think for the purpose of this conversation, I want to focus primarily on LLMs or large language models, as they are known. So large language models, even if you haven't heard the term, you are probably familiar with it, are any sort of system from ranging from ChatGPT to Gemini to Claude to Llama. ChatGPT is, of course, run by OpenAI. Gemini is Google, Claude is Anthropic, and Llama is Meta. So while all LLMs are probably are AI, all artificial intelligence are not LLMs, right? So, and there's also another conversation to be had about how artificial intelligence itself is a marketing term. इस पे भी बहुत बहस होती है, people
Mm,
disagree, and there's been a lot of back and forth. But I think for our purpose, we're primarily concerned with LLMs. So to answer your question, I think we also need to understand how large language models work, right? So essentially, they are giant statistical prediction machines that repeatedly predict the next word in a particular sequence, right? They are trained on large pre-existing data sets produced by humans. And a lot of the stuff that they are trained on are works of art or works of philosophy or works of political science that already exist in the public domain. And that's a conversation that maybe we can also, or a topic rather, that we can also refer to a little later. Now, Timnit Gebru, who was the lead researcher at Google, published a paper in 2021 called, which used the term stochastic parrots to refer to LLMs. And what she was really saying was that essentially LLMs statistically mimic text without really understanding them coherently. Now, bearing in mind this paper was published in 2021, we are having this conversation in 2026. So in this rapidly accelerating technological landscape, maybe a lot of her understanding of how LLMs function is maybe not applicable. And there was pushback to the paper that she published, and I would encourage everyone to read it. It's available on the internet. As a side note, she also ended up leaving Google because they were not happy with the findings of her paper, and they wanted her to retract it, and she did. So all of this to say that I think all the AI produced literature that I have come across personally strikes me currently as derivative. It's not producing anything original. It can replicate genres, novels, stories that already exist, but I don't think it's producing anything unique. Now, that isn't to say that it couldn't do so in the future, but abhi ke liye to mere khayal se, you could kind of use it as a tool, but that also only works if you have a pre-existing skill set, which means you already know how to read and write. So I think currently all the AI writing we've seen isn't always slop, but it is pretty much slop.
It's interesting that you said, you spoke about all the AI, produced literature that you have read. And as a teacher, I'm sure you read a lot of, different types of stories and texts that are submitted to you by students. How is it working in academia? And as a teacher, how are you grappling with the use of AI, of LLMs by students, right? So are you
Yeah.
able to tell that this is AI generated text that's been submitted to you? Or how are also students feeling about this? Um,
I mean, it's a mixed bag, right? So on the one hand, because I teach writing for a living, and I've been teaching for, well, it'll be close to 10 years, but not exactly 10. Um, I have a, like you develop a familiarity with the cadence of human writing, right? So as soon as ChatGPT emerged on the scene, you're seeing a lot of the work that's being produced by students is homogenized. I think we're all kind of familiar with the AI ticks. So you've got the M dash, which I really think we need to reclaim because I love that form of punctuation. You've got the tricolon and rule of three. So people will write in lists, but they'll write in sentences that are they write in paragraphs that are continuous lists, right? So, for example, if they're saying um, the government, the job of the government is to protect, empower, and enable citizens, they'll follow it with another sentence that is also a list. Now, the function of
mm,
a list in writing is कि आप उस list पे फिर elaborate करते हैं, right? So, if you're just producing a paragraph which is list upon list upon list, it's essentially gibberish. Obviously, there's now we're all familiar with the it's not X, it's Y construction. LLMs also tend to produce sentences that are very short. There's not a lot of sentence variation. So at this point, I can't unhear it. I'm on social media. I see somebody's sort of Instagram post, which might be an infographic. It's using LLMs. Captions are using LLMs. Fashion, क्या नाम है? Fashion designers who are producing collections are producing all kinds of like ad copy that is very obviously LLMs.
and even the models are AI generated now, right?
Exactly, exactly. Even the models are AI generated. But to return to your question, I think a lot of the problems that are being caused by AI generated writing pre-existed before ChatGPT was made open access in November 2023, if I'm not mistaken. So as a teacher who has been teaching writing for quite some time now, I think that the way that we teach language in universities was already flawed to begin with, right? The three-part essay structure with an introduction, a beginning, with an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, with lines of argument, with a thesis statement, is an insufficient and uninteresting form of writing that we have been teaching students for a very long time now. I'm not sure what the replacement to that would be, but if you are already teaching them a formula, then of course the LLM can mimic that formula, right?
Mm.
So I think a lot of the issues that AI has created pre-existed ChatGPT, and also are questions that universities need to ask themselves about their pedagogical practices. I think the humanities writ large all across the world have not done a very good job of explaining why they are important and vital and needed, right? So AI has really just exacerbated existing problems. And on a final note, I will say this, look, if we also at universities we often give scholarships or give entrance to students who may come from varied educational and class backgrounds, right? So अगर आप एक बच्चे को दाखला दे रहे हैं एक prestigious यूनिवर्सिटी में, and you are not providing them with the commensurate language support that they might need, because English might not be their first language or Urdu might not be their first language, right? If you are not providing them with those resources, then you can't fault them for using, any LLM to
Mm.
produce work. So, it's a complicated problem. I don't think there's an answer to it. Globally, also, you've seen universities abroad. I'm talking particularly about North America, integrating AI very quickly, despite there being resistance from both teachers and students. So, it's a problem that I think universities need to take really seriously. Bless you. And I think it's a problem that uh, is not going to be solved overnight.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because I was just reading University of California, Berkeley Law School has completely banned AI, whereas there are other universities that are allowing a certain percentage of the work to be, AI
Exactly.
assisted. So that brings me to the question, how can writers be using AI, right? And how is it changing the writing process? So can AI be a collaborator? How do we credit it in academic works or in writing, for example? And what is happening to the drafting, to the editing, to the experimentation, the multiple drafts that come out? What role is AI playing, and in your opinion, should it play?
I mean, I'm a bit of a Luddite in that way, which isn't to say that I don't use LLMs, but I use it for grunt work, really, like for more technical forms of writing. But specifically with regard to the creative process, I'm not quite sure. I do know people who use LLMs. Personally, I wouldn't want to feed it a draft of my writing because the editing is also integral to the writing process, right? Through editing, you develop skills in the future that will allow you to avoid making the same mistakes that you're making in the current draft of writing that you're working on. I intuitively thought it might help with things like structure with regard to plot, but I've also heard from writers that if you actually feed it a draft of a novel, for example, it kind of messes up the structure if you actually haven't trained it sufficiently so that it understands what you're trying to do, right? So you already have to also expend a certain amount of labor for it to work in a way that might be productive for you. The way that I use it, honestly, is as a research assistant at this point. So, because my writing tends to be pretty heavy in terms of research, both in the context of history and theory, I use it to just give me articles, books that I might need when I'm writing a story. उसमें भी आपको मतलब you have to be a little careful because I mean, you know this, it hallucinates. So it could give you a book or a poem or a text that doesn't exist. And this happened recently with a writer called Meena Kandasamy. So she started getting these requests from professors all over the world saying, "Okay, you've written a poem called Caste, but we can't seem to find it on the internet." And it turned out that some Indian academic had asked an LLM to generate a syllabus on caste, and it had also hallucinated the fact that she had written this poem. He had included it in the syllabus, and then other people saw, oh, this poem exists and has been written by her. So she was fielding requests for a poem that didn't exist. So us lihaz se bhi, it can be a little tricky if you're not doing your due diligence.
And I've heard lawyers complain about this too, because the LLM will give them a reference to a case, and when they try to look up that case, it does not
It doesn't
exist.
exist.
And that's where the issue of verification comes in. Like any research, I think relying on AI, especially by students, right, who are in the learning process, and with younger students who are growing up in the age of AI, assuming that it's something that they can rely on. It's fundamental for everyone to understand that you have to verify, triangulate any information, be it,
Absolutely.
however beautifully it's, being presented to you, to look it up and not just use that
Exactly.
citation otherwise. And these issues can come up in exercises like literature reviews in research,
Mhm.
where you it might be very tempting to tell your chatbot to give you a literature review on a certain topic, but once you get into it, um a lot of it is non-existent.
And I think
So we've
that's also where, sorry to cut you, Osama, but I think that's also where a pre-existing reading practice is essential, right? Because you're not going to be able to parse that information that is being presented to you unless you already don't know how to read. And I think we are also living in a time, and this was a problem that again existed before ChatGPT became open access, which is that we seem to have more writers than we have readers. So people are very attached to the
mm,
idea of being a writer without actually realizing that if you're not really reading, you're not going to be able to produce a piece of writing that is rich, layered, complicated, nuanced, and so on and so forth.
absolutely. And that brings us, very fluidly to the next part on what happens to the readers, right? So we're seeing that consumption of art has really transformed. We saw this time of NFTs come and go
Yes,
in no
yes.
time. But we're also looking at people, you have poets like Rupi Kaur, who has built an entire empire based on her Instagram posts, right?
Yep.
And people seem to be enjoying that shorter, bite-sized poetry that they're getting to read. Um,
Mhm.
but we're also thinking of, okay, if AI can be generating stories, and like you said, there are more writers than readers, and if AI starts doing that and people start publishing that, what happens to the art of literature, right? And then also, what happens to our attention spans? Like, are we able to read Gone with the Wind, or War and Peace, or what are we reading, and how is that transforming in what you've seen?
So, I mean, I think we all know our attention spans are fried, right? And vertical short form content, I think, has really put a number on all of us. I mean, leaving aside the question of books, I think most people find it incredibly difficult to sit through a movie without, taking out their phone or double screening. And we were talking about this earlier, and I'll return to the question of reading in a second. But we were talking about this earlier with regard to how Netflix is now encouraging screenwriters to explicate plot lines and storylines for the viewer because most people are going to be double screening. So they'll have their phone out, they'll be watching it either on their laptop or on their TV. So we're seeing the sort of very corrosive effect on our attention spans happening in real time. What I would say about reading, though, is I also think that this notion of reading as somebody poring over a large book over the course of an afternoon or spending 8 hours reading something is a very romanticized, kind of idealized notion of what a reader is, right? So I'm not sure about War and Peace or Gone with the Wind for that matter, but with Charles Dickens or Dostoevsky, for example, these were authors who were serializing their work. And the people who were reading them because they had mass readerships were not reading them in one go, right? They were reading them on a weekly basis or maybe a fortnightly basis. So I think some of the panic about attention spans is a little misplaced because people don't read in a linear fashion. Having said that, yeah, I think it's also a question of because there is such um, an explosion, a plethora, and there is such an excess of text and media that you can consume that kind of the task of the any artist of trying to cut through the noise to get a
Hmm.
person to get the, for lack of a better word, consumer to their product. And again, consumer product, all of this is a little loathsome for me to say, but uh, the task of getting somebody to actually uh, approach or know of the existence of a work of art has become really difficult. So I think the
Hmm.
task that artists now face is that we are also content creators alongside being
Hmm.
artists, right?
And Palvashi, this also makes me think, will people seek authentic human voices? Will they be able to tell if it's an authentic human voice? And just knowing that a work that you're reading is AI generated change how we experience or perceive it? Because oftentimes, when you're reading something, you're often reading the profile of the reader, of what their experiences have been, where they grew up,
Mhm.
what they did over the course of their life. And that gives you context into what they're trying to say. If you have AI doing that, how would that change the experience of reading for an average reader?
So, a couple of points with regard to that question. A lot of literary magazines in North America and Europe, I'm not sure what policies, literary magazines in Pakistan have as of right now, but a lot of little magazines in the global north have issued statements saying we are not going to accept any AI generated writing, right? Some universities have also done this. There is no homogenized policy. It really varies from like university to university also, where if you are using AI, you need to attribute that in your bibliography, right? So there are some measures that are being imposed by the culture industry and universities as well. But another really interesting thing that happened recently was both the New York Times and the New Yorker ran this sort of experiment in their respective publications where they paired an AI text with a human text and they asked readers to figure out which is which. And I think the vast majority of people got it wrong. Like they thought that the AI text was human and the human one was AI. And there was a real moral panic on Twitter. I'm not going to call it X for a very long time about this. And, everyone, there was a big hullabaloo and everyone was really upset. But if you think about the parameters of that experiment, I don't think you can judge whether something is written by a human or by AI just by reading an excerpt, right? Like these were short paragraphs.
Mm,
So I think with those experiments, there was that issue. There have also, to build on that point, been many studies now that show that a lot of humans prefer AI generated writing. And the reason why I am not in too much of a tizzy about that is because, look, AI writing is also based on human writing, right? It's based on data sets that were created by humans. And also, I mean, and I don't mean this in a snobby way, but there's also a lot of bad human writing out there in the world, right? Like there's a lot of human writing that, I mean, as part of somebody's artistic or writing practice, that's wonderful, but that I may not enjoy, right? Like if you think about the types of work that are the most popular, and I'm not criticizing the genres per se, but I'm saying if you think about authors who are bestsellers, the vast majority of them are also relying on genre conventions, or the storylines are hackneyed, the writing or the writing isn't as important as the plot is, right? So I think there is also some people or a certain subset of people really do crave human writing. So I think in the future, we're going to begin to see a lot of artistic works that are either stamped or prefaced with the fact that this was done by a human. Spotify is already doing this, by the way, with music. So some musical artists or some songs they will specifically or categorically say, this is not AI. But then again, Spotify is also part of the problem. So creating this little badge doesn't really resolve the many issues at hand.
right. And, just thinking about the future of, say, creative expression with large language models, and you explained it really, really well in the beginning. You described how it is, it's predictive, but also that it's basically scraping the internet on pre-existing material, right? But what that is doing is that it's picking up material and work and creative work that, blood, sweat, and tears have gone into by writers like you and others, picking that up, using it, and then generating other stuff that people are then paying for by virtue of being subscribers to these, different AI services. So where does the copyright and ethics of all of this come in? Because you're not being credited. And in the art world, this has already been an issue, right? The imitation versus inspiration
Exactly.
debate. Um, but with AI, there's a new angle to it because, yeah, initially you had one artist copying another artist, the style of writing or the style of painting, but now you have a billion or even $1 trillion company making even higher profits based on your
Exactly.
hard work, not giving you any compensation, not giving you any credit, but you know, making this appearance of look how easily I did this for you, and people who are using it are like, wow, this is amazing. We don't need to hire a writer. We don't need to credit, an artist. So in looking at all of this, um, h- how do you see like the future of creative expression and writing?
So I am not too familiar with the specifics of this case, but I have been sort of following it in a superficial manner. And I think the New York Times is suing both OpenAI and Microsoft for basically copyright infringement, right? And part of their argument, and please correct me if I'm wrong, was that they were able not only that these companies were able not only to scrape what was already publicly available, but they were able to get past the paywall, right? And access information or articles that were meant for their subscribers. So I mean, and they're suing them in billions and billions of dollars in terms of the damages that they're seeking. So that is a lawsuit that I know a lot of writers in America are particularly keeping a close eye on, because I think that will determine a lot of a lot of future outcomes. So there's that. But that's the thing, right? Like it's when people make the analogy of LLMs being similar to the creation of the printing press. The thing about the printing press was that it wasn't stealing work from other people, right? Like it was just making books or texts or works of art, and by works of art I mean text primarily, like it was just making it more accessible to the general public. So it wasn't just that आपकी aristocracy or आपका जो religious order है उनकी monopoly होती है knowledge पे. What the printing press did was that it allowed everyone, not everyone, but more people to access, disseminate, and produce knowledge. So I always find that analogy when people compare the printing press to LLMs a little erroneous. But that's precisely the problem. I also don't really have an issue with people using AI as a tool, right? The problem is these corporations who are making an obscene amount of money are not compensating artists for their labor. And that is what LLMs kind of like bypass, right? Which is the labor of producing a work of art. It is a laborious process. It is a process that, it can be quite joyful and delightful, but it can also be quite boring and unsexy. And there's a drudgery that is required to produce something that is meaningful. So I think that in terms of copyright, again, we're following this case. Let's see what happens. But I also want to add one more point really quickly, which is that for most writers, if you do have copyright over your work, in most cases, the work will go into the public domain it could be 50 or 70 years after you die, right? So I do think that works of art should be made accessible to the public, right? But not at the cost of enriching these corporations.
So perhaps we can touch a bit about, the writing circuits and how important, prizes for writers are. And a lot of people, rely on that. A lot of writers rely on that in terms of marketing. And I'm wondering how publishing houses, but also, these bodies, critics, and others who are giving these literary awards are looking at AI currently.
So, there have been two recent controversies that have taken place pretty much within a very short time span. They kind of followed one after the other. So the first was the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, and the second one was the Harper's Bazaar Prize. So the Commonwealth Short Story Prize is open to any writer who is living in a Commonwealth country, and there was a writer who won the award. I'm forgetting his name, but users on Twitter were very quick to point out that they thought that the story in question had heavily used AI. I believe Granta, which publishes the winning entry, decided not to publish the story. It decided not to go ahead with publishing the story. Um, And it created an adjacent controversy, which is that I believe the gentleman in question was of Indian heritage or descent or something. And then there was a conversation about can white readers or white authors read writers from the global south with the same amount of sensitivity, and are they more prone to latching on to Orientalist kind of
Mm,
stereotypical prose? So that's a slightly separate conversation. But then a similar thing happened with the Harper's Bazaar Prize. Again, many writers and readers were quick to point out that they thought it was AI generated. I'm not sure what the outcome has been in terms of the publication of that story. But what is interesting to me is that there is a reaction. There is a sort of public furore when people get a sense that something is, and and I yeah, when something is inauthentic, right? When they
mm.
feel like they're being deceived or lied to, they get angry about it. And to this end, I also want to recommend this book. I don't know if most people will be able to access it, but if you message me on Twitter, I can send you a PDF. But it's called Techno Negative: A Long History of Refusing the Machine, and it's been published by the University of Minnesota Press in March 2026. So it also kind of details how every sort of form of technological progress is very quickly followed by reaction against those forms of technology, and how that is also very deeply linked to our desire to retain our humanity, right? So
Mm,
I think that's
mm,
also like a really interesting resource. I think this is a problem that will continue to plague the literary world and prizes in the foreseeable future. I also think it's a problem that's compounded by the fact that most people who are reading for literary prizes are not paid, and they have to deal with large volumes of stories or texts that they have to get through. So perhaps if you hire more people and if you compensate them better, their judgment or discernment will also meet the demands of the hour.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like, drug testing in sports, right? And so writers are using AI. Um, but when you were speaking of this, it also, and I was glad you brought in, the disbalance between the Western Europe and the North America and the rest of the world, the global majority, right? And then how AI, in so many terms, is perpetuating that very disbalance that exists globally. And then it's a lot of white male engineers and tech workers who are working on these AI models. And I was recently reading this very interesting article that said that most AI LLMs, chatbots will assume that you're a white male, and you have to identify yourself in terms of your identity for it to be more accurate and more relevant to who you are. And in those terms, we're also seeing that when the use of these chatbots is increasing, that inequality is being perpetuated over and over again, right? In terms of what information is available, what information it's scraping, and then presenting it to whoever is asking these questions anywhere in the world. And of course, in the writing world, these power disbalances are very much there too. Um, so just we've talked about writing, and it's brilliant to have you because you not only practice writing but you also teach writing, right? So what should literature classrooms be teaching now? Now that we have LLMs and AI and large, the use of these technologies has become so increasingly pervasive.
I think like engaging in too much AI boomerism in the classroom also make the kids kind of think you're a bit of a boomer, right? Like you're just not hip to what's happening in the world. And I mean, the reality is that everyone's using it, right? I mean, I use it to a degree, maybe not in my creative work. And everyone is using it. It's pervasive, it's ubiquitous. I think that, for example, alerting them to how or explaining to them how these models work is of importance. Because
Mm,
while I think that the younger generation is 100% way more savvy than us in terms of getting things done in the digital realm, I do think there is a lot of media illiteracy about how the platforms that we use work, right? So um, like even with the so I just a short example. I had shown I'd shown some students Naare Na ki music video by Ali Azmat in the classroom. This was a media studies class. And I asked them, how would you figure out when this music video was made, right? And this music video had been posted by, I think, pktunes.com or something like that was the username on YouTube. And rather than looking it up on Google search or going to Wikipedia, seeing if there was a page for the music video, going to the citation, checking if the date listed was correct, they were like, मैम आप मतलब उधर देखें ये 2009 में पोस्ट हुई थी तो ये उसी मतलब ये उसी वक्त रिलीज हुई होगी ना, not realizing that different
mm.
people can post different content at the same time, and this isn't Ali Azmat's official YouTube page, but
And
all of
YouTube
this
didn't
to
exist when the song came out.
and YouTube didn't exist when this song came out, which is why it was posted later. Exactly. So I think there's a lot of illiteracy about the fact that about how these platforms operate and how they work. So educating them about that is paramount. Secondly, I really think that we need to move to like a studio model when it comes to writing, one that is borrowed from the visual arts. This is not
Mm,
something that I came up with. I was discussing this with a friend and a colleague. And I think, when you write, not in isolation, but in community, when writing becomes a more interactive process, if you're spending, say, 4 hours consecutively writing as a group and thinking and having a conversation rather than a class that runs for maybe an hour, 15 minutes twice a week, I think that could be more conducive, right? And I think I mean, and not everyone is going to be sold on this idea because obviously different people have different skill sets. I think trying to get students and people, not just students, adults, trying to get them to find material that they enjoy reading is paramount. And there is something for everyone. Like every time somebody tells me I don't like to read, I'm like, okay, that could be true to an extent, but that also just means you haven't found the writing that appeals to you. And trust me, it exists somewhere. It doesn't have to be literature with an uppercase L. It could be anything. It could be sports writing. It could be nature writing. It could be, you could read a self-help book if you find that interesting. But I really think it's a question of of also making literature and writing um, making it seem less elitist, inaccessible,
mm.
and more approachable, perhaps. I think that's one of the many things that we need to do. Another thing that a lot of us are doing in the classroom is we've gone back to blue book exams. So you're doing all of your writing in the classroom and
Mm.
no devices. So I mean, works to varying degrees, but did that answer your question? Did I?
Yes.
Yeah.
But 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 yeah, and I think this discussion has really brought forward many more questions, but a lot of answers as well, right? Because at the end of the day, people do want to read writing by humans, but maybe some will enjoy the AI generated stuff that they're getting. Maybe they want something light. Maybe they want something that is based on pre-existing literature that, or maybe, they, like you said, maybe they can't find what they're looking for and they generate it through AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of people are doing that too. But at the end of the day, the human element and, in storytelling, the human element is always unique, like you said in the beginning. And that will remain, something that most people will seek if they're looking to enjoy writing, looking to enjoy reading. So thank you
Oh,
very
yeah.
much for joining us, Palvashay. This was
Thank
a
you,
very,
Sana.
very interesting conversation, and it raises a lot further question. But I think your ideas around changes in pedagogy are very, very important. And then of course the take home aspect of teaching is going to reduce with this over reliance on AI. And I think what's also very important is for teachers and professors to also gain these skills on detecting what is AI and what's not AI, but also not relying simply on AI tools to tell you that this is not AI, because that also will
Oh,
give
they're
you a
so
lot of
they're so
errors.
janky, they don't work. I mean, they're inaccurate most of the time. Can I just say one thing really quickly?
Yeah, yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
So just coming back to the human aspect of writing, I really think that the best literature is not the literature that is grammatically correct or polished or that reads coherently or correctly. The best literature in the world often breaks those rules, right? Like
Mm,
in Absalom, Faulkner has like a 1,200 word run-on sentence. A run-on sentence is grammatically incorrect. So much of good writing will use different vernaculars, which may not be regarded as grammatically correct, but that's what makes the work alive and vivid and real. And I think human imperfection is what makes for a good work of art, right? And finally, I do want to say that my own love of literature was also cultivated by your mother, who was my literature teacher. So I wanted to give her a little shout out because I don't think I would be here talking to you about this in the capacity of a teacher if it wasn't for her. So,
when you
yeah,
said run on sentence, I was thinking of her because whenever I have a published
yeah,
work, she will send me a message and say, "This sentence is too long."
this is too long. Yeah.
Well, no, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. And that's it for today. I'm your host, Usama Khilji, and we'll be back with another episode on DigiPod News English next week.